Okay, so let's dive into what we're talking about today, which is that broader universal perspective, the concept of general humanist philosophy. After all, Jews are not the only people who have asked these deep questions and sometimes come to more secular answers. And this goes back to the Hellenistic period. You remember that epithet Epicurus comes from a Greek philosopher, Epicurus, who lived in, I believe, the 3rd century or 4th century BCE. So again, several hundred years before the Talmud is written. There's Greek philosophers asking these deep questions and often coming to secular answers. And in terms of how this meshes with our identity in an evolutionary perspective, I found the best parallel to think about mitochondria, if you remember your biology at all. Mitochondria are these little organisms inside of our cells that produce energy and have some other function in cleaning the cell, but originally they were separate. They were outside of our cells and were sort of incorporated into them, and then they have their own DNA, called mitochondrial DNA. It's actually a way to trace matrilineal descent, because you only get that from your mother, who provides the egg. The father's sperm is just simply genetic delivery vehicle for the DNA. There's no mitochondria in there. So when you study the mitochondrial DNA, it's a way to study mother's descent, but it also at one time was a separate organism. So for us, when we read humanist philosophy from Greeks, from WASPs, from any other ethnic group, we can think of it as kind of a mitochondrial addition to who we are. It still contributes to our approach and formulating our thought and how we approach Jewish tradition. But at the same time, we recognize it comes from outside of the Jewish experience, even as it contributes to who we are. The basic concept of a naturalistic philosophy goes back to the Greeks. That's not a Jewish invention. It is a Greek invention. The concept that you could explore the nature of the world, the nature of human beings, based on reason, instead of religious revelation, oracles, supernatural sources, the gods, that was a revolutionary concept, even in Greek culture, to move in that direction. As you may probably know, the roots of the word philosophy are philo, which is to love, and sophos, which is knowledge, or wisdom. So a philosopher is one who loves knowledge, who loves wisdom, who pursues that. In fact, the word for reason in Greek is logos, which has that sense of logical in English as well. So one example of how these questions could push the envelope a bit is a dialogue by Plato. Most of Plato's works, as far as I know, all of them, are written in a dialogue format, where you have one character talking to another character, or several characters talking to each other, and the message is brought out in the interaction between the perspectives. Even that, again, is an interesting format choice. That truth comes out of dialogue and debate and discussion, and not from imposition and direct voice. In any case, in one of his dialogues called the Euthyphro, he asks an interesting question. He says, are the things that we call good, good because the gods said so? Or were they good before the gods said so? In other words, let's say, love your neighbor as yourself is a divine command. Is it only good because a God said this is good? Or would it be good even if the God didn't say it was good, and the God said it because it was already good? Which comes first? The moral value of the statement, or the author defining it as good for us? And again, that's a very radical kind of a question, because if the statement was good independent of the God saying so, maybe you don't need the God to say so. You could just get the statement. On the other hand, if the God defines what is good, then they could also define killing Canaanites as good, or oppressing women as good, or having slavery as good, which to our mind is manifestly not good. So that balance of the authority of the revelation versus an independent basis for what defines the good is a very interesting debate, and Plato is raising that question. Now, Plato himself had a kind of supernatural side to his thought, as we explored a little bit yesterday, but that doesn't mean that he can't raise interesting questions that have an impact on religious belief. So the other example that we often give of Greek philosophy that has an impact on our approach is Epicurus, whose approach was you should enjoy this life because there's no afterlife that we know of, and don't worry about the gods making your life miserable or intervening, because why would a god have anything to do with human beings? You know, if a god's happiness were dependent on humans offering sacrifice and praise and worship, then they wouldn't be happy sometimes. And how could they be perfect and godly if they're dependent on human beings? So don't bother praying, don't bother sacrificing, enjoy this life. Does anyone know in English what an epicure is? Yeah. What's an epicure? So no, it's specifically focused on food. It's sort of a bastardization of the Epicurean ideal. His approach was love and enjoy life. He actually wasn't a gourmet. He had a very simple life. In fact, his opponents were very frustrated because he was a good person without religion, and he lived a good life and lived a very simple life. Because if you have simple pleasures, then they can easily be met, as opposed to more complex ones. At the same time, modern use of Epicureanism has sort of sometimes even taken it to the extreme. Someone who indulges in things too much, who's focused only on the pleasures of the flesh and not the pleasures of the mind. That was not how Epicurus approached it at all. There's actually, I think, a website called Epicurus, which is a food blog, because it's focused on that food side of the meaning of the term. But if you actually read Epicurus, he reads very humanistically. So let me give you one example. It's not in the source book, but it's called the Epicurus Paradox. God either wants to eliminate bad things and cannot, or he can but does not want to, or he neither wishes to nor can, or he both wants to and he can. If he wants to and cannot...
Will that be on the test?
No. So you've got the four possibilities. Either he wants to eliminate bad things and he can't do it. He could eliminate the bad things, but he doesn't want to. He neither wants to nor cares to eliminate them. Or he wants to eliminate them and he can't eliminate them.
It's a 2 by 2.
So if he wants to eliminate them and he can't, he's weak. And that wouldn't apply to a God.
Yeah.
If he can eliminate them but doesn't want to, then he's mean, which is equally foreign to a God. If he doesn't want to and he can't, he's both weak and mean, and so he's not a God. And if he wants to and he can, which is the only thing fitting for a God, where then do bad things come from? Why doesn't he actually do it? So that's the Epicurus Paradox, where it challenges belief in an all-powerful, all-good God based on the human experience. And again, that kind of a reasoning process that leads to a challenging of religious promises has a real resonance for us. I mean, a classic religious answer to that might be an afterlife, right? It looks like he's not eliminating bad things, but actually it's part of a big picture that turns out fine. Or maybe human perspective is limited. There are other answers to this question called theodicy, or why do bad things happen to good people? But Epicurus raising that question in the 3rd century BCE is really fascinating. And if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, in Hebrew called Kohelet, which made it into the Hebrew Bible, it reads a lot like Epicurus. He's asking similar kinds of questions. He says, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? And I've spent my life accumulating wisdom, and I'm still going to die. You may spend your whole life building up something wonderful, and then you leave it to your Nebuch of his son, who's going to ruin it. And you can't take it with you. Better to be a living dog than a dead lion, he says, because life is better as it is. Sometimes the best you can do is simply enjoy life now, and that's all you can hope for. So there's a very Epicurean strand to that thought that made it even into the Hebrew Bible and this wisdom literature of Ecclesiastes. Yes?
Didn't the Greek concept of gods, and they project an awful lot of human frailties on them. They were jealous, and so bad things happening to good people would be in direct acceptance of how they viewed gods, though.
Well, yes, when you have a polytheistic system, theodicy is not one of your problems. Bad things happening to good people happen all the time in Greek mythology because the gods are not defined as all good or all powerful, right? They're neither all good nor all powerful in that classic mythology version. They can't do everything because they fight with each other. There's a king god who can overrule the lower gods. And they are not good. They are as good or bad as people are, which is a mixed bag. So that was never a problem for a polytheistic system. Even if you broke it down into one all-good God and one all-bad God, or a God and a Satan, you could still have an answer to why bad things happen to good people. But once you eliminate all the other options out there, either in a religious system that says there's only one thing worth calling God, and he's all good and all powerful, or in a philosophic sense, which is Epicurus' version, that it makes more sense for there to be one divine force than to be lots of different sub-divine forces. Either a philosophical or a sort of religious-based monotheism, you're going to wind up with this problem of why bad things are happening to good people. And by the way, this is still grappled with today. There's a very famous book by Harold Kushner, who's a conservative rabbi, called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's not even why. They happen. When bad things happen to good people. And the conclusion Kushner comes to at the end of that is, I can't believe in a God who would intervene but doesn't. So he decides to demote God's power. He solves the paradox by saying God wants to, but he can't. He can encourage us from the sidelines. He can help us along. He can give us strength when we're at the end of our rope. He can show that he loves us in distant ways. But he can't intervene on the field. And Kushner's experience, he had a child with this disease that causes premature aging and died at like 10 or 11 years old. I mean, terrible experience. And so it caused a crisis of his traditional faith because he couldn't accept that a God could have done something and did not. Now, the book is a very interesting read. He raises all the right questions. He has a section on talking to children about tragedy and trauma that is fantastic. It's like a 10 or 15 page section that I would apply to any humanistic setting. But in the end, his concept of God for me still is not compelling. I often use the example, I wrote a piece on this on my blog and I think in our journal, called Our Quarterback, Our King, based on the Our Father, Our King version. Traditionally, God is described in the liturgy as a quarterback, like a Peyton Manning style quarterback. He calls all the plays. He makes everything happen on the field. If you're good, he'll call your number again and again and give you reward after reward. If you're bad, he'll cause you to go to the bench or lay you out for the defensive back to smack you, and you're going to suffer if you cross it. But he's doing everything. In modern theology, God is either the coach, who's on the sideline, who draws up the plays ahead of time, but he can't intervene on the field, or he's the cheerleader. That's the Kushner God, who is encouraging you and go, go, go. But again, he can't intervene on the field. And so the dilemma for me when I look at the traditional liturgy is, why are you talking to the cheerleader like they're the quarterback? If you want a cheerleader God, that's fine, but you should talk to them as if they're a cheerleader God and not as if they're the God that intervenes on the field. In the traditional Birkat HaMazon, or blessing after meals, there's a line that always jumps out at me. It says, I have never seen a righteous man go hungry. I say to myself, what world are you looking at? Because good people go hungry, and bad people go hungry, and neutral people go hungry, and mixed people. I mean, people go hungry.
And bad people win.
And sometimes bad people win. So we have to, again, this is our challenge on the liturgy side, how to maintain some continuity when we just don't believe that even a redefinition version is going to work with that text. Yes?
I feel like what humanistic Judaism and maybe atheism lacks is that comfort that people get from the unknown power that might be lurking in the universe, giving support. Like, I feel like what you were talking about Epicurus, like, yep, when you're dead, too bad, you're gone. And I feel like people don't, it's hard to imagine that and accept that, and so I think that it makes people have to wrestle with much more uncomfortable feelings, and that's why people, I don't know.
Well, that's one of the factors. When Madeleine Murray O'Hair, the famous atheist, was asked on a talk show once, if you don't believe in a heaven or hell, what happens after you die? Her answer was, you rot. And while that may be scientifically accurate, it's not particularly comforting to think about. So we often talk about a kind of natural immortality and the bond of the good works that you do, and people's memories, and the positive impact you have, that kind of thing. And the other approach we have is it makes life that much more important. One of the lines is that humanists believe in life before death. And so we emphasize action here and now and making the most of our limited time. But the other piece that's important is that we have this human need to feel loved, to feel supported, to not be alone. That can be met by this concept of a God, but it can also be met by people. And that's why you have communities, that's why you have friends, that's why you have family, so that you don't feel alone. And that you feel supported in a tangible way. I had a member once who had a cousin who had a relapse of breast cancer, and she asked me, if I gave you her Hebrew name, would you say a prayer for her? And I said to her, I have a better idea. Give me her phone number, and I'll call her. And then she'll know that someone is thinking about her. We can talk about her condition and make her feel better. We can talk about the Chicago Cubs, and that may make her feel better or worse, depending on the season. We can talk about what to do in her limited time left if it's a terminal situation. But she'll feel like she's less alone. Rather than sending words up there and who knows what happens, Let's focus on what we can know and do, and so that is trying to meet that need that religion has met, but with human pieces. So this is just one example how a philosophical discussion can open up a conversation and an understanding of the human condition in a way that we have to try and find a way to answer those questions and meet that need. Yes, Natalie?
Tangentially,
No,
the satirical science fiction writer Terry Pratchett, late Terry Pratchett, has a great novel called Small Gods. And it's written from the view of the gods who are shrinking in power and dying out because people no longer worship them. So once again, another way to feel guilt. If you want the good gods to survive, you have to worship them. You have to conform.
Right. I don't believe in fairies.
No?
Yes.
I mean, as a humanist, you rot just doesn't sit well with me. The who knows does. The who knows. I mean, we can deal with what we know, but who knows what happened? Nobody.
Well, the question is what's plausible. That is, if our personality is contained in the electrical signals in our brain, and when we die those stop, then it is possible that that's the end of our consciousness. There may be an undetectable something that continues in some way. Maybe you wind up in a grasshopper. Maybe you live on in some universal sea. Okay, well, you don't always get that choice. I'm always impressed that everybody in a past life was a king or Cleopatra. Nobody was a dreck hauler or a laborer it's always very impressive. But this is one of our challenges. Can we live with the I don't know? And philosophy begins with acknowledging what you don't know. I mean, if you read those early Socratic and Platonic dialogues, Socrates would say, I'm the wisest man I know because I'm willing to admit that I don't know.
Right.
And so sometimes when people ask me, again, a philosophical question, what happened before the Big Bang? Where did everything come from? The most honest answer I can give them is, before a certain point, I don't know. We don't know. Although I prefer to say we don't know yet, which means maybe we can learn. Maybe there's a way we can learn more. At a certain point, we didn't know what happened before the age of the earth. We didn't know, and then we added to that knowledge because we had a desire to learn more. But I can live with the correct answer. You can say God and it's a guess, but if I say I don't know, that's true. And I can live with that answer as long as I don't give up on learning more. There's a couple more, and then we have to get back to the roots because now we're in the basic ideas class, which is a different seminar.
Herb Silverman was challenged, where do you go? Where are you going to go when you die? And he said, to medical school, like my mother always wanted me to.
So, contrary to
Sarah. No, Sarah.
I was raised, of course there's nothing after death. Of course we turn into
Fertilizer.
Yeah, food for the worms. Of course we're going to become a bird or whatever. So to me, that's just as natural as anything. And my mother was so atheist, and as I don't know. Anyway, so she had this horrible death, and she always believed that there are atheists in the foxholes.
So, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Invention of Lying with Ricky Gervais. Oh, you have to see it. Okay. It would be a good ornament program. It's called The Invention of Lying.
What's the last word?
Lying. The Invention of Lying.
Lying?
Not telling the truth.
Not telling the truth, right. The Invention of Lying.
The Invention of Ted Cruz.
The premise of the movie is that people have not evolved the ability to lie. So they always tell the truth. And then all of a sudden, this one man evolves the ability to lie. And of course, the society he describes in a society of no lying is hilarious, because you show up for a date and the woman says, boy, you're shorter than I thought you'd be. And he says, you are way out of my league, because they just say what they think. And all of the movies they have are documentaries where somebody sits and reads a script, because even somebody acting like something in the past would be lying. So the other interesting feature, of course, is there's no religion in this society where nobody lies. And then this man's mother is dying, and she says, I'm afraid. And he says, don't worry, because he can lie. He says, don't worry, Mom. After you die, you go up to this big man in the sky, and you get a mansion with everything you wanted, everyone you've ever wanted to see, and you won't be alone. And then she dies. And he's crying at her death, and the doctors and the nurses are all staring at him saying, tell us more about this place in the sky. Because, of course, they assume he's telling the truth. And it just goes on from there in terms of how he invents a whole system based on this and how they're grappling with the realities of, well, what if you want to live with your family in the mansion, but they don't want to live with you? Or what if you have two families? And what if and they're negotiating these issues. But it's a very, very amusing take on the question of truth and falsehood and religion and human need and so on. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the Greeks and Greek philosophy. You can see already how that approach can be very fruitful in terms of evaluating how we approach what we do, the kind of programming we provide, the kind of mutual support that a Jewish humanistic community can give you. When you enter the Renaissance, you have an entirely different kind of humanism. In the Renaissance, humanism meant interest in all of human culture, and also a focus on the human condition. As I mentioned, the portraiture and the focus on perspective transforms art. Instead of reenacting the historical stories, you can write and draw and create about today. You can live in the contemporary human experience, not just the ancient human experience. And also you can focus on the human form in sculpture, in art, and learn from all of human knowledge. The ideal was someone who knew everything. Leonardo da Vinci, who wrote and painted and designed and engineered and did all of these things. There's actually a very good essay in your packet we're not going to go through called What is Humanism? By Fred Edwards of the American Humanist Association. And he explores a lot of those subversions of humanism that have evolved historically. So in modern times, there are a lot of different philosophical schools of thought that have lent themselves to humanism. Some of them you may agree with very strongly, some of them you may disagree with very strongly. But I want to go through a few examples of these schools of thought, and if any of them sound particularly attractive to you, I encourage you to explore more in various directions. So one example is modern skeptical thought that begins to ask questions and says, how do we know what we know? And is it reasonable to claim knowledge of things of which we do not have direct or immediate experience? Can we even trust our own senses to describe the world accurately? Or could we just be a brain in a jar? And somebody's adding stimulus to us and we have no proof of the outside world other than what our senses tell us, but we know our senses can be deceived. We can think we hear things or think we see things that aren't really there. And so how can we really rely even on the evidence of our own senses? You have Spinoza, who begins to ask questions about revealed religion, about social order. You have David Hume, who in addition to demolishing the watchmaker theory, as I described last time, where he asks questions about what kind of gods really made this and does it really work as well as everybody claims, Hume also raised questions about cause and effect. He would say things like, okay, if I drop this pen, it's going to fall. Well, I know that it fell last time. And I can guess that it's likely it's going to fall this time, and it did. Am I positive it's going to fall the next time? How can I know that? That is, cause and effect is always something we look at retroactively. But we can't be, how can we know for sure that every time I drop this pen it's going to work? We extrapolate from past experience, but it doesn't mean we can predict for absolute 100%, no question of certainty it's going to work out the same way the next time. I mean, these are the people who say, is there really a desk here? You know, and when you hear this, you start to like bang on the furniture. Well, this is really here. I know it's here. But of course, you're just relying on your senses. So this is the skeptical approach to human knowledge that also has a corrosive effect on religion. Because maybe the claims of revealed religion are less believable. I mean, David Hume, again, has an essay on miracles, where he says, the only evidence we have of miracles is not even our own senses, because for some reason miracles stopped. What we have is testimony of other people. And how believable is personal testimony? Certainly from ancient times. You know, there's actually a very funny chart I saw on Facebook just yesterday, where it says reports of UFOs are very high, and then it says photography invented. And then a few years later, Photoshop invented. You get a lot more reports of UFOs. The reality is that the testimony and miracles and so on, we often will ask questions about. And even when someone says, I had a personal experience of a supernatural process, do we have to believe their interpretation? I don't doubt that they thought they saw something, but does it mean they actually saw something, or is their interpretation valid? Is it just a coincidence that Muslim mystics meet Muhammad, and Christian mystics meet Jesus, and Jewish mystics meet... Why doesn't the Christian mystic meet Muhammad? I mean, isn't it plausible that if one is right and the others are wrong, there's some crossover there? Or is it how they're interpreting a particular process of the brain that leads them to be susceptible to that kind of vision? I mean, that's where the skepticism comes in. And there's actually large movements, publications, and so on, even today, of people who define themselves not as atheists, but as skeptics, where they want to find reasonable scientific proof for the claims that people are making. And if there's no proof behind it, then they won't believe that. And so that holds true in a lot of areas of life. Yes?
A great popularizer of this is the amazing Randy.
Mm-hmm. Who was a magician himself and went around looking at faith healers and claims of miracles to point out the techniques they would use. Very famously, there was a revivalist, I think his name was Peter Popoff, who was doing these faith healings. And Randy somehow figured out, they noticed he had an earpiece in his ear. And so they found the radio frequency for the person who backstage was telling him, this seat is this person with this ailment. And then he would, in the revival, say, sitting in seat 7B is Mary, who has been dealing with a sore hip for many years. And let's call for prayer and healing. And of course, the adrenaline runs in her, and she jumps up, and she can jump around, and she's miraculously healed. And how did he know? It must only be a miracle. So he went on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show, and he played the video of Popov doing the miraculous revival, and then he played it again with the audio playing in the background, so you could see how the miracle was done. But that's the debunking phenomenon. And by the way, some people are debunkers who still believe in it. One example from Jewish history, Harry Houdini. Who was a magician, who was in tremendous physical shape because of the work that he did to do the magic that he did. He was a believer in spiritualists and people who could contact the dead. He very much wanted to speak to his beloved mother, who had died many years before. But when he went to visit spiritualists, he saw through their fooling techniques. They would like make the table float with their foot, and they had assistants who were bringing in spectral images and things. And so he became a debunker, a spiritualist, trying to find the real thing. But in the end, his willingness to ask questions debunked a lot of people who were defrauding the public. Okay, so skepticism is one trend. Another major trend in philosophy is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism isn't asking questions about knowledge or nature as much as it's exploring how people behave. It's a moral and ethical philosophy. Its originator was a man named Jeremy Bentham, but the man who wrote a book called Utilitarianism is named John Stuart Mill. Also wrote very interesting political philosophy too. But in Mill's approach to utilitarianism, the way he formulates it is what defines what is ethical is not what the gods say, and not what religion says, but what makes something ethical is what produces the greatest good for the greatest number. That's what's useful. And so you're basically defining this, some people call this approach to ethics consequentialism, because you're defining what's good by the consequences for people. And not just for yourself. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. Now this does raise some interesting challenges. Who defines what's a great good versus an ordinary good? Do you seek elevated pleasures of the intellect and spirit, or base pleasures of physical satisfaction? Who gets to decide the greatest good for the greatest number? And are there any limits on that? After all, let's say we have a lot of people in need of organs, okay? And we have a young, healthy 25-year-old man. Could we take that person, whether he or she consents or not, and take their organs to save the lives of many other people? You have one death, but you've saved 8 lives or more. Well, if it's the greatest good for the greatest number, maybe a little bad for one, or maybe more than a little bad for one, but maybe some bad for one person based on the lives of several others, that's worth it. So you often hear these moral scenarios of the runaway train, where there's a train running and there's no brakes, and there's a switch track up ahead, and on the left side is a baby carriage with a baby in it, and on the right side are 5 escaped criminals from a prison, and which side do you flip the switch for the switch track? Or the other example that I always found both macabre and interesting was you're in a spelunking party, you go into a cave, and all of a sudden the water begins to rise in the cave, and the way you came in, you can't get out anymore. There's a little hole at the top of the cave that you could theoretically get out of. Unfortunately, the first person to try and get out of that hole is a little bit overweight and gets stuck in the hole. Now, fortunately or not, one member of the spelunking party has a stick of dynamite. And the question is, are you morally allowed to widen the hole? Now, the result of widening the hole will be the death of the person who's stuck in the hole, who will survive, by the way. His feet will get wet, but his head is already out of the hole. Now, to save the rest of the party, are you allowed to intentionally kill an innocent person? It's just bad luck. You didn't do it maliciously. Well, most people would come to a conclusion, yes, to save the lives of the rest of the party, you can kill this one person by blowing them up. But the problem is, how do you rationalize that? How does that apply to general society? In what other context would this kind of reasoning be appropriate? That's where utilitarianism comes in, because you're trying to balance the rights of the individual and the needs of the group. And are there, I mean, the approach I found most meaningful is something called rule utilitarianism, which has some basic guidelines that you can't cross, and beyond that you use the utility analysis. So killing the person just to take their organs, that would be inappropriate, but killing someone to save many lives in an emergency circumstance might be more appropriate, and you have to tease that out. Yes, Luke?
This reminds me of what you said a few minutes ago, whether it was worth disrupting the lives of Arabs in the Holy Land to make a Jewish state that the Holocaust survivors and others could come to.
Or even pre-Holocaust to save their lives, that's right.
When I took philosophy, my professor described it as hedonocalculus was the term.
Yes.
What kind of calculus?
Hedonocalculus. Like hedonism, a calculus.
Hedonocalculus, you're doing the math. I mean, the dilemma is, of course, that sometimes that individual rights becomes a problem for a utilitarian analysis. The other time is you can get what I would call paralysis by analysis. So you have to make a moral decision on something, but what would really produce the greatest good for the greatest number? What would have the best consequences? Sometimes there's negative consequences on both choices. And sometimes it's hard to tell what the consequences will be long-term in a particular decision. I mean, think about, we mentioned this yesterday, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, where the goal was to provide better housing for everybody, and so they created these housing developments. What it did was undermine individual self-ownership, undermine neighborhoods, undermine communities, created a culture of dependency. The approach to welfare at one time had automatic payments when there was no second earner in the household, which incentivized not having a second earner in the household because you would wind up worse off than if you stayed on the payments. Oh, did I turn off? Okay. So this is that law of unintended consequences that makes a purely utilitarian analysis more challenging.
There are two of us who don't agree with you, but we'll debate it later.
Okay. On the Great Society?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But again, different people will analyze the same data and come up with different results, highlighting the issue that the analysis is not always as clear as a thou shalt not murder or a bright line religious rule.
Well, they're doing the same thing with seniors now. There are these huge developments for seniors that are not cheap.
Right. And then the question becomes, which is the best to subsidize? Is it better to keep people in their homes and aging in place? Is it better to encourage them to move into a shared facility? And different people are going to make different choices on that. And then when you get to the level of social organization, that's where you're making the greatest good for the greatest number calculus that may be very challenging to do.
It appears to be warehousing. I mean, it's warehousing just like the ghettos in Chicago under
Well, and it depends. For some people, it actually opens up social possibilities in community, where if they can't drive or they're isolated in their homes, it's a much worse experience for them. But again, and we'll actually get into this when we talk about objectivism. Can you make a decision for somebody else of what's good for them? And that's where social policy and individual autonomy sometimes run into conflict.
You mentioned Lyndon Johnson. just coincidentally, he told a story of one of these moral dilemma stories. It involved two trains are headed toward each other, and there's a switch, and one train is full of a lot of people, the other train isn't, and so this kid is asked at the military intake interview. He's asked what he would do in that situation, and he says, "I'd call my brother." And the interviewer says, "Why would you call your brother?" And the kid answers, "Because he ain't never seen no train wreck before."
No, what I was thinking of with the utilitarianism philosophy is that I think it's the problem that you get into is when people define who is more important or which groups are more important, and they would rather save the lives of people that are like me than. So I think that then you get into very confusing territory of like, should we drop the atomic bomb? Well, yes, because those people are totally different than us, and we deserve to live. So I think it gets
sure, group identity and who counts as a full person or a partial person. But you can make that argument in a different way. If you had a pro-life perspective, and your perspective is that a full human life is the fertilized egg, then the individual autonomy of women to make their own choices about pregnancies versus the good of the greatest number of all those little people in there, you could use the utilitarian analysis to say that abortion shouldn't be legal because of the good of those entities and not just the women involved. Again, they would say, I wouldn't say, they would say temporary inconvenience versus living or not, again, which is the greater good or the greater penalty. So, again, utilitarianism, another interesting approach, at least in part to try and answer the how can you be good without a God, right? You can look at consequences beyond yourself. And one of the points that Bentham and Mill made that I think is underappreciated sometimes is their argument that this is how most people reason anyways. It isn't just, this is how you should read. This is how people tend to make decisions. They sometimes make it with a very selfish aim, but if they're talking about a moral and ethical decision, most people, Ayn Rand objectivism aside, would focus on what's good for the most people. That's how they tend to make what they consider to be moral decisions. So it's not just that utilitarianism has a platform and a message and an encouragement, but it also has a descriptive side. That this tends to be how people make decisions anyways.
Well, but behavioral economists would now say this is how people rationalize the decisions that they've made on an emotional basis.
That's right. This is the other, very good point. The other weakness to utilitarianism was the assumption that we sit down and dispassionately analyze what the right decision is to make, assuming we have the luxury to sit down and think about it. But as, you could read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink and a lot of other examples of this, a lot of people use reason as rationalization. They make a decision first, and then they come up with reasons to justify what they've already decided in a snap emotional decision. And it's less often that they have an initial response, analyze the details, and then decide to change their mind to do something else. It does happen, but it's a much less common phenomenon.
But that does not mean that philosophizing is useless, because in a calm moment, the society in general can reach a conclusion which may predispose people's sudden reactions in the right direction.
And that's another important point. When we're doing moral analysis and reasoning, it's not always about past events and evaluating whether they were good or not, but it's sort of setting the mental habits in place so that when the opportunity comes again, you might make a different decision. You think about, for example, Rob Portman, who's a senator from Ohio, who was very opposed to gay rights and gay equality until his son came out as gay. And it changed his perspective. Now, you could have imagined he would have followed a consistent line and said, this is my deeply held belief and I'm not going to change. Sorry, son, I still believe it no matter what. And on the other side, he decided, now I have a different appreciation of the issue. I've changed my perspective. You can argue which is more morally supportable or valid. You could argue on both sides of that particular question. Is it better to be consistent even if it doesn't affect you, even if it does affect you, or should you change in response to new analysis? So another example of a school of thought that had a strong impact on humanistic Judaism as it developed, in particular on Sherwin Wine, is a school of thought called logical positivism. How many of you have ever heard of logical positivism? Oh, some, okay. How many more not university professors have heard of logical positivism? Okay. So the basic approach of logical positivism, which developed in the early part of the 20th century, was that nothing is real unless it's provable by science. They would even have strict rules for sentences. Sentences can be true, they can be false, or they can simply have no meaning. If you can verify it's true, then it's true. If you can verify it's false, then it's false. But some sentences have no meaning. There is a God. Well, you can't prove that, true or false, because a God is supernatural, beyond this world. And so they would say, that sentence has no meaning. It's unprovable. It's unverifiable. And a statement is meaningful only if you can prove it empirically. Now, the dilemma is that you can't prove all statements. For example, if I said all ravens are black, can you prove that? You have to collect every single raven to prove empirically, demonstrably, that it is absolutely true. Now, a response by an English philosopher named A.J. Ayer was to make it a little bit more subtle, to say that you can have strong verification and weak verification. You can talk about what's probable in life as opposed to what is absolutely true or absolutely false. And so the dilemma was that logical positivists claimed to have an approach that would explain all of the universe. That some things are true, some things are false, and what decides if it's true or false is what the evidence is for that claim. And when I first read about logical positivism, I said, it's humanistic Judaism. Because Sherwin Weiner was very influenced by this logical positivist school of thought. And in fact, when asked to describe his own theological perspective, he coined a new term. He claimed someone else coined it, and the other person claimed that he coined it, so I'll take the Sherwin attribution that's on Wikipedia. It's the term agnostic. Agnostic means we don't know and there's no way to know. You can't verify it, there's no evidence for it, so I'm going to act on what I can know and what I can prove. And the idea of whether there's a God or not out there, there's no evidence that you could possibly give me that would prove that there is or isn't a God, so I'm moving forward. I sometimes make this shorter as don't know, don't care. It doesn't matter. It's not agnostic saying I don't know, it's saying agnostic, we can't know, there's no way to know.
Does agnostic come from ignorance?
Right, it's the same background, there's no way to know. And that's a clear extension of a logical positivist approach to knowledge. It would say there's no empirical evidence you can prove one way or the other, so we're going to go that route. The dilemma was that when he was called before the Michigan Board of Rabbis, and he was asked, are you an atheist? His response was, well, if what you mean by atheist is what most people mean by atheist, then yes, I'm an atheist. Headline in the newspaper, Rabbi says, I am an atheist. Because he didn't get the subtlety of what he meant by agnostic in the newspaper headline. They weren't misquoting him, that was part of what he said, but the subtleties were not referenced there. Yes?
I always thought there was another dimension to agnosticism, that it doesn't matter to my life whether there is a God or not, because I'm going to be a moral person whether he's there or not.
Well, the kind of God that you could prove, says the agnostic perspective, the kind of God you could prove wouldn't make a difference. It's not going to be a God that reveals the Torah, that rewards the righteous, that punishes the wicked, that resurrects the dead, that cares what you eat, all that stuff. So the kind of God one could prove is irrelevant anyways. There's a passage in his Provocative People where he's describing Spinoza, and he says that the deist, who believes there was a God way before everything and isn't intervening anymore, the pantheist, like Spinoza, who believes that there's a God and God is all of nature, but again, doesn't intervene, isn't a personality, and the atheists largely live a very similar lifestyle. In fact, his characterization of the deist approach was very clever. He said, for deists, God is a deity emeritus, which means he did his work, and he's done, he doesn't check his messages, he doesn't show up in the office, but he's retired.
Somewhere else.
But again, the practical consequences of that kind of a God are going to be the same as an atheist or an agnostic, where there isn't a God watching me, so I have to do things differently. And so sometimes when people ask me, when I get to that I don't know before the Big Bang, whatever might be before the Big Bang is, again, not the God of religion. There's an old saying that the God of Aristotle, the prime mover, the God of Aristotle is not the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's a personal God who intervenes in the world and writes a Torah, and that's not the God of the philosophers.
Are you saying agnostic or agnostic?
No, IG.
IG. And
So-
how is that different from agnostic?
So an agnostic would say, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just don't know. An agnostic would say, there's no way you can know. So yes, I don't know, but there's no way that you can know. An agnostic, in theory, could be convinced by something one way or the other.
So really, the Big Bang is still a theory.
Well, again, the question of scientific theory versus speculative theory, I mean, people use that against evolution, too. They'll say evolution is just a theory. But there are a lot of scientific theories that have a lot of proof to them. They're not quite a law of science, but they're a much stronger, verified version of knowledge than simply a speculation or a hypothesis.
We can detect the cosmic background of radiation.
So we know something happened.
Absolutely.
Right, there's a lot of evidences that suggest that that's the case.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say that your story about Sherwin-Williams, I feel like a similar thing just happened to Neil deGrasse Tyson. That people were like, "Are you an atheist?" and needed him to define it, and he was like, "Who cares? Stop asking me. I don't care. Why should you care?" And it kind of like turned into this big like, this does not define who I am, so stop talking about it. And
Well, look, that tribalism of wanting to claim people as part of our group not only applies to Jews, it applies to secularists and atheists. I mean, how many people do you know who are convinced that Barack Obama is secretly an atheist? And he just can't say it out loud because you can't get elected for that reason. He's only been a member of a church for decades. He only talks about his faith all the time. He only emphasizes his religious belief at the National Prayer Breakfast every year. I mean, if you're basing it on evidence, how much evidence do you need to suggest that he actually is personally religious and yet smart? Amazing. But that has to do with one's theory of religion.
If you were an atheist, you wouldn't get elected.
Yes, but that doesn't prove that he's an atheist. If you're again looking at the evidence, the preponderance of evidence suggests that he in fact is personally religious. So this is where logical positivism has some contribution, the idea of emphasizing evidence, what's likely, but also there were limits to that approach too. After all, how do you prove that logical positivism is correct? How do you prove that the only way to know if something is true is there's evidence? Is there evidence for that? It sort of has a self-referential problem. When you make an absolute statement, how do you prove that absolute statement without the absolute statement? And the other challenge is that there are sentences that have meaning that we understand, but are not necessarily empirically verifiable. So if I said, I love you, we know what that means. That has a resonance. Maybe you understand it differently than I mean it, because there's a love you have for a student that's different from the love you have for a spouse, that's different from the love you have for a child, that's different from the love you have from a teacher. Those are all different kinds of love. You know, like the Eskimos' word for snow, that story.
Well, the Greeks have all those terms for love.
Different types, yeah.
Right, there's all these different kinds of love. But the point is, if someone says, I love you, that has meaning even if it's not necessarily empirically verifiable by the canons of scientific knowledge. So that's where logical positivism, again, has some limits, but has some contribution to the conversation. Another example of a philosophic school that was useful and contributed to our sense of humanism is called Existentialism. Most often presented by the French writers Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. The existentialist approach basically says you find yourself existing in the universe. You wake up one day and here I am. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't choose to be here. I just am here. And the question is, what do you do now? Once you exist, what are your choices? And they believe in absolute human freedom in that people are judged by their actions and choices in reaction to the situation they find themselves. That is, you find yourself living under German occupation during World War II. And you have a choice to acquiesce to that occupation, to support that occupation, or to resist that occupation. Now, they would argue that you always have a choice, including suicide. That is, if your existence becomes intolerable, then you can end your existence. And that might be the most moral choice in a certain context. But in the end, you're trying to react to a world that you didn't choose. And in particular, you have to respond to a universe that doesn't necessarily care about humanity. Some people speculate that because Albert Camus' mother was mostly deaf, that he learned very early on that the universe does not listen to your concerns. If you ask for help, sometimes no help is coming. And they also emphasize the importance of the subjective human perspective. Again, you can't necessarily know what other people are thinking. You have to rely on yourself. So there is a kind of self-sufficiency side to existentialism. But there's also an element of, I wouldn't say despair, but a lack of hope, let's say. That the condition is going to be the condition. And this is inevitably the human condition of isolation. You can do your best to collaborate with others, but in the end you're going to be on your own and making these decisions of how to respond to an absurd experience. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, the existentialists very often, thanks in part to Camus and some like the notion that life is empty of given meaning. You know, you have to make some meaning for yourself, and so there's this kind of pessimistic or to existentialism. But the very same universe that is empty of given meaning is full of potential. I mean, so the choice is, you know,
Right.
you can emphasize that, or you, I suppose, more truthfully, you know, recognize both possibilities.
So a famous metaphor that Albert Camus used was the myth of Sisyphus.
Mm-hmm.
You may remember from Greek mythology, Sisyphus is condemned to an eternal torment where he has to push a boulder up a mountain. And just when he gets to the summit, the boulder falls back down, he has to go back down, pick it up, and push it again. And for Camus, that was his metaphor for the human experience. We have to slog through life. It can feel like a great punishment. And then the question is, how do we respond to that reality? And at the end of his book, he says, we should imagine Sisyphus happy. Because if we accept that this is our lot in life, and this is our burden, if we take that existentialist approach, that this is what the world is, then we can find joy in the striving, in the pushing. Maybe this time it will be different, or maybe I can find enjoyment even through this difficult existence. So the existentialist claim would be you have to acknowledge the reality first. And once you've acknowledged the reality, then you can find happiness in those limited circumstances. That's part of the balancing act. So the last philosophic school I want to talk about, and then we'll look at some more uplifting stuff, is what's called Objectivism, as articulated by a woman named Ayn Rand. Now, ironically, Ayn Rand herself is of Jewish background. Her birth name was Anna Rosenberg. She was born in Russia. She was about 11, 12 years old when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. Her father was a pharmacist, so sort of a small business owner, who of course was immediately dispossessed by the Bolshevik Revolution, thus creating a lifelong antipathy to her in any kind of government confiscation of private property, because she saw what happened to her father when his business was nationalized. She managed to escape with her family. They came to New York. She was very impressed by capitalist America. She actually moved to California, became someone who typed up scripts for Hollywood, and that's when she took her name. She liked Ayn better than Anna, and she took her last name from the Rand typewriter that she was using as a symbol of American industry and ingenuity. So the basic approach of Objectivism was to start from what is an empirical reality. No one can think for anyone else. No one can feel for anyone else. And therefore, she would argue, no one should make decisions for anyone else. I don't know better than you what you want for your life, what will make you happy, what will satisfy your needs, what will fulfill you as a person, so I shouldn't be making that choice for you. In the end, the most important power we have is the power as individuals to be in charge of our own life. And so the goal for a moral life, based on that reality of individual experience, is that individual happiness, rather than collective happiness, should be the major goal of an ethical life. If you can fulfill yourself, then you know that you're fulfilled. I can't assume that I can make that choice for you, and therefore I should facilitate your ability to make your choice for you. And if we can collaborate based on an analysis of shared need and basically an individual contract, then we can work together. But you can't force me to do that because you have no right to infringe on my individual choice, just as I have no right to infringe on yours. As one person put it in a different philosophic context, my freedom of action ends where my fist hits your nose.
I was about to say that.
Only so far you can go. And she was very opposed to religion because she saw that as, again, imposing someone else's belief on the individual free mind. And she believed very strongly that individual human reason was the best tool to improve both the collective human good and also the individual human good. So here's a short 4-point version of her philosophy that she wrote. Again, not in the packet. I'll read it slowly and see how many of these 4 you agree with. It'll probably be more than 0, but it is unlikely to be all 4. Okay, so here are the 4 points. Reality exists as an objective absolute. Facts are facts, independent of man's feelings, wishes, hopes, or fears. Again, she's using gendered language, so to see through it, people's feelings, hopes, and fears. Second, reason, the faculty which identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses, is man's only means of perceiving reality, his only source of knowledge, his only guide to action, and his basic means of survival. 3, man, every man, is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. He must exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself. The pursuit of his own rational self-interest and of his own happiness is the highest moral purpose of his life. And 4, the ideal political economic system is laissez-faire capitalism. It is a system where men deal with each other not as victims or executioners, nor as masters and slaves, but as traders by free, voluntary exchange to mutual benefit. So that's a...
Barry Cohen agrees with every one of those points.
Which Barry Cohen are you talking about?
Okay, so that's a short summary of her approach. Now, we understand that the political platform of libertarianism, which grew out of that, is one that emphasizes free market capitalism, individual choice and autonomy, and is very opposed to government intervention, regulations, taxation, all of those areas where they would argue the collective is infringing on the individual.
You would never build a highway or a school.
Well, I understand. I'm not saying that we take the entire package, just like we don't take the whole Bible as gospel, part of the Bible, and that we have to adopt every moral rule that's there either. But I would argue that there are some elements of this philosophy that are important to us. I mean, part of the reason many of us left a religious Jewish identity is because we made that individual choice to make up our own mind, to use our reason to evaluate the universe and to make a choice for our happiness. People who leave an ultra-Orthodox setting are told, well, you're going to destroy the Jewish people. That's a collectivist ideology. Is it what you're doing good for the Jewish people? Well, you can ask the question, is it good for me? Does it make me happy? It's not just, that Kennedy ideal of ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, but what can I do for myself? And there is something to be said for individual self-actualization. I was speaking with someone recently who, when they first heard AFO-RE, felt alienated by it. I forget who it was. It was Carol who said this. I'm sorry, I keep saying the wrong name.
That's all right.
Anyways, Janet said, that I felt this was so individualist, and you throw in the "oh, and you too" as an aside at the end of the song. But when you're coming out of a setting which is so group-oriented, what have you done for the Jewish people? What have you done for the Jewish state? How are you contributing to the group? And then you get to ask the question, what can I do for me? How can I find my own strength? How can I find my own inspiration? Then it's a kind of liberating experience. There's a balancing act that we have between individual self-actualization, which is an important goal, and a sense of we're in it together and we should make some choices that may not benefit us individually, but benefit the group. That's the utilitarian side. So when you have utilitarianism on one end and you have objectivism, individualism on the other end, then you're trying to find some balance between two legitimate approaches to part of what makes life meaningful. Yes?
Outside the St. Thomas Business School in downtown Minneapolis, there's a sculpture called The Self-Made Man. And it's a block of stone, and you see a torso.
Chiseling himself.
But where the hell did he get the hammer and the chisel? I mean, we exist because we meet each other's needs. He was not born alone. He was born of something.
The question is not just we exist because there are others. Obviously, there were parents who came before us. There's a society that nurtured us, that provided schools and roads and security and other elements. The question is, do we have to live for each other? Or is there a space where we can live for ourselves? Remember, the collectivist ideal of the Soviet Union was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. but not by choice. It was determined by a central bureaucracy. This is all you need.
Well, the other thing I like
Individuals may have a
that
different response.
I often thought that sculpture was a joke because the self-made man is a chiseler.
Chip off the old block. Yes.
But I agree that I feel like if you take her philosophy to its ultimate conclusion, then you should only do things that are good for yourself, and you should not do things that are good for others, because that brings you down, because then you're helping others instead of helping yourself. And I feel like that's where it gets kind of turned.
Well, she might argue that you could choose to help others because it makes you feel better, or because you figure you're creating an obligation system where they owe you something, or you figure it's better for society if you choose to do that. But to make it mandatory is where she would have an objection. So, for example, some schools have mandatory volunteering. Mandatory community service, mandatory charity contributions. And that's where she might argue, if it's charity and you're choosing to do it, that's fine. But to make someone do it, or to force someone to do it, then it loses that sense of voluntary contribution that is part of the point.
Which can equate to taxes then, too.
Okay, so that's where she would say that taxes is, again, going beyond that reasonable permission. And look, again, I'm not saying I buy the whole program, but I see that there's an argument behind it. And the other thing we have to realize is that some people who are involved in the secular world, not only in the general secular world, but also as secular and humanistic Jews, come from this more libertarian individualist perspective. And so they are also part of the big tent, and they also have an impact on some of the choices that we choose to make. And any kind of collectivist or socialist-oriented or group-oriented ideology or ethical action should keep in mind some of the valid points of individual self-actualization, individual autonomy, the right to have the product of your own labor that Rand is emphasizing. Yeah.
And I think maybe a good thing to bear in mind in terms of thinking about objectivism carried to sort of its full logical extent or its fullest extent is it's not logical positivism doesn't support it. Like when you look at the science around like how, you know, basically like how evolution works, how organisms work, like you are not a successful organism if you try to survive completely on your own. Like our selfishness as individuals and like our ability to survive and propagate is dependent on our interconnection, you know, and the support that others provide to us.
The Randian approach doesn't say you live on an island. There are other people around. The question is, do you collaborate by mutual agreement? Or do you collaborate because you tell me what I can and can't do, and that I have to give some of my stuff to you or to a group or to people I don't know? That's what she would argue. It's not that that you're living in an island. The question is, what is the basis for interaction with other people? Is it mandatory or is it voluntary? And again, there's a spectrum here on the pole of how much is individual autonomy and how much is not. Look, no one here, no one who's involved on the left side of the political spectrum would argue that the Soviet system was a great example of full actualization because it eliminated individualism. It eliminated freedom of speech. It eliminated, you were an enemy of the people, you were a counter-revolutionary, you were put in the gulag if you challenged what the collective, i.e. Stalin, determined was good for the group. And so any kind of democratic socialism still has room in it for individual property, for individual businesses. It's not necessarily the state owning everything. That would be collectivism to its extreme. Utilitarianism to its extreme can get to the absurd. And so I think a couple more comments and then move on to a little more inspirational material.
Yeah, just to expand on what you're saying a bit, Eva, the concept of democracy is exceptionally compatible with these notions of humanism, because it's rational, informed people choosing to interact and reason together and so on. And speaking of the choice, we're all here by choice, except my wife made me come here. No, not at all. We're all here by choice, right? We're all in SHJ and Oramet by choice and so on. And one of the reasons we value being there is this democratic, civil, informed reasoning together, right? And so that's a way of thinking in these same terms, but extending it to the group.
Yeah.
This has become a major political problem for the wider humanist movement, that we are criticized as being soulless, automaton, and we don't give to charity and all that stuff. And so Foundation Beyond Belief and other responses are attempted to win a place in the political matrix for humanists to have, to show that we have feelings about other people and that we carry our share of the load within the political collective.
Yeah, I mean, I see posters all the time or posts on Facebook that say, become an atheist, save 10%. Instead of giving your tithe, keep it for yourself. And I always respond to them and say, there are no other causes that are worth supporting with that money that you would have given to the... You can't do good with that in some other way. Again, choose your charity. I mean, even libertarians can support literacy programs and other ways of emphasizing human self-actualization. One of the best charities, my wife, she works for a Foundation Beyond Belief that supports non-proselytizing secular charities. There's a program in Boston, I forget the name of it, on the south side of Boston, that teaches people of a lower income level financial literacy. How to manage bank accounts, mortgages. Again, it's emphasizing their self-actualization. It's not giving them money. It's not providing a kind of dependent model. It's training them in being more in charge of their own life. And that would be almost a kind of, I mean, again, you could say it as a kind of libertarian social service direction as opposed to just providing the good at the end and assuming what's good for them. Some societies, by the way, don't do food stamps. They do minimum incomes. Like in Switzerland. The lower people who can't meet a minimum income on their own are given money from the government to get a minimum income, but it doesn't tell them how to spend the money. It's up to them. And so that's another alternative model, which would allow people a minimum standard of living, but instead of saying this has to be on food, and this has to be in housing, and this has to be in healthcare, it's giving them the choice of how to actualize it. So there's no one way to solve these issues. Yes, so what I was going to say is, I have one more topic I want to cover before the break, briefly, and then we will take a break.
Could I ask you, going back to the first point of Ayn Rand, reality is about as definable as God. You know, I think we all have our different realities, and it's not a matter of, we can't prove a reality. We can't even prove really a lot of facts, because as time goes on, those, quote, facts change as we know more.
I think there's a balance between individual perspectives and whether or not there is actually an objective reality. I would guess if you polled everyone in the room, they would agree that there's a Starbucks cup on the table. That is a case of reasonably objective reality. Now, could we all be being deceived? This is actually a hologram of a Starbucks cup? It could be. But it's most likely that it's not, given the variety of perspectives. So I would argue that if you add up all those subjective perspectives, you can get to a reasonable approximation of what's objective out there. And the only way you do that and compare them to what's reasonable is using reason and evaluating who's a valid testifier and who isn't. Okay, so I want to end with something inspirational. This is in your packet, and it's an example of American free thinking. It goes back about 120 years or so. There was an American lawyer whose name was Robert Ingersoll, who was one of the most famous public speakers of his day, in an era where there wasn't any mass media and public speaking was a major public entertainment. He was known as the celebrated agnostic. He challenged religion, he challenged piety, he was personally 100% upstanding and moral, which drove his critics crazy, just like Epicurus. And Ingersoll did a great job of putting into words the way a lot of us feel about both religion and living the good life as a secular person. We have heard talk enough. We have listened to all the drowsy, idealist, vapid sermons that we wish to hear. We have read your Bible and the works of your best minds. We've heard your prayers, your groans, your amens. All of these amount to less than nothing. We want one fact. We beg at the door of your churches for one little fact. We pass our hats along under your pews and pulpits and implore you for just one fact. We know all about your moldy wonders and your stale miracles. This year we want a fact. We ask only one. Give us one fact for charity. Your miracles are too ancient. The witnesses have been dead for nearly 2,000 years. Or another example, shorter. Who can overestimate the progress of the world if all the money wasted in superstition could be used to enlighten, elevate, and civilize mankind? We've compared the benefits of theology and science. When the theologian governed the world, it was covered with huts and hovels for the many, palaces and cathedrals for the few. The day of science dawned, and the luxuries of a century ago are the necessities of today. Men in the middle ranks of life have more convenience and elegance than the princes and kings of theological times. There is more of value in the brain of an average man of today, a master mechanic, a chemist, a naturalist, than there was in the brain of the world 400 years ago. These blessings did not fall from the skies. They did not drop from the outstretched hands of priests. They were not discovered by the closed eyes of prayers. They are the children of freedom, the gifts of reason, observation, and experience. He also said, no man with a sense of humor ever founded a religion. On to the next page on 59. If, with all the time at my disposal, with all the wealth of the resources of this vast universe, to do with as I will, I could not produce a better scheme of life than now prevails, I would be ashamed of my efforts and consider my work a humiliating failure. I love this one. The clergy know that they do not know. What?
It's Donald Rumsfeld.
Well, the unknown unknowns and known unknowns.
Yeah.
He points out, labor is the only prayer that nature answers. It is the only prayer that deserves an answer. Good, honest, noble work. And then we actually use part of this last piece in our congregational services at the high holidays, starting with for thousands of years. For thousands of years, men have been writing the real Bible, and it is being written from day to day, and it will never be finished while man has life. All the facts that we know, all the truly recorded events, all the discoveries and inventions, all the wonderful machines whose wheels and levers seem to think, all the poems, crystals from the brain, flowers from the heart, all the songs of love and joy, of smiles and tears, the great dramas of imagination's world, the wondrous paintings, miracles of form and color, of light and shade, the marvelous marbles that seem to live and breathe, the secrets told by rock and star, by dust and flower, by rain and snow, by frost and flame, by winding stream and desert sand, by mountain range and billowed sea. All the wisdom that lengthens and ennobles life, all that avoids and cures disease or conquers pain, all the just and perfect laws and rules that guide and shape our lives, all thoughts that feed the flames of love, the music that transfigures, enraptures, and enthralls, the victories of heart and brain, the miracles that hands have wrought, the deft and cunning hands of those who worked for wife and child, the histories of noble deeds, of brave and useful men, of faithful loving wives, of quenchless mother love, of conflicts for the right, of sufferings for the truth, of all the best that all the men and women of the world have said and thought and done through all the years. These treasures of the heart and brain, these are the sacred scriptures of the human race. Just jumps off the page. You know, and these were things he delivered in a very powerful voice, but it was inspiring to a generation of people. And this concept of free thought, that you can make your own decisions, you can live your own life, and be joyful. I mean, this is not a depressing existentialist. This is someone who's inspired by everything that people have done. And that positive enthusiasm is the kind of positive humanism that we would like to see in our communities too. So when we come back, I'm going to tell you a story of another freethinker from the same era, whose name was Ernestine Rose. Never heard of her. She's certainly worth learning about. And then we'll also talk about our own movement and other varieties of secular and humanist identity that are out there.